Okay, we are going to go through the parts of the respiratory system today. So we're going to try to do this. It's from my MacBook, so we'll see how well this works. We talked about the fact that parts of it were the nose, where you inhale the pharynx. There are actually three regions of the pharynx. There's the nasopharynx, there's the oropharynx, and there is the laryngopharynx, which is by the larynx. All of those are an opening or an area that lead from your nose and mouth to your actual pharynx and the pharynx itself. All three of those are located in this area. It leads to an area in the respiratory system that's the larynx. We also call that your voice box. At the base of that, or at the top of that, there's the epiglottis that steers food into either your esophagus or your trachea. Below that is the trachea, and the trachea is going to branch into two bronchi. Those bronchi will go smaller and smaller until they get to bronchioles. Functions of your respiratory system. It oversees gas exchange between the blood and the external environment. It takes place within the alveoli or the air sacs. And the other function is the passageway from the nose to and the mouth to the lungs. Part of their job is to warm, to purify, and humidify incoming air. So the cilia and the mucus that are on there help to capture impurities and take them away from the air. So let's look at the nose itself. We know that it is the only externally visible part of your respiratory system. When you inhale, it goes through the external nares or nostrils. On the inside, it is divided by a septum. Remember, the nose is mostly made up of cartilage. There is a very small region of bone up at the top. Those nasal passages, and that's like if somebody breaks their nose, the placement of that bone can affect how air goes in and out of the nose. So if you look at this, we also have regions called sinuses. That right there is your frontal sinus. You have, and I'm not going to expect you to know the names of the sinuses, but they know that they are there. Part of them is the fact that they're an air cavity that allows to equalize the pressure in your head and make your head lighter. The other thing is it allows it to collect mucus when you are draining. So here it shows the nasal area. Notice that the nose and the mouth are separated by a plate. You have a hard palate, which is in the front by where your teeth hold, and at the very back is the soft palate, and that soft palate ends in what you can see in the back of your throat, which is your uvula, and there also are your tonsils, and the tonsils help with, some of that helps with your immune system. So the nasopharynx is back here behind the nose, the oropharynx is right here behind the mouth, and the laryngopharynx is back here right before you actually hit the vocal cords. So you have the esophagus here. Epiglottis is going to be right here before you start. It is at the top of the laryngopharynx. Oops, let me go back here. I don't know why I lost my pointer. There we go. Go back to that picture. It is right here. It is the flap that covers. This is your esophagus going beyond here. So that flap goes down and closes when you are breathing. It closes this way. When you are swallowing, it makes sure that that tube excuse me, is closed for respiration. So its job, it's a flap that covers the respiratory system when you are swallowing. Otherwise, that's also why sometimes when you're draining and stuff, since it goes down the same tube, that it can either go down the esophagus or into the trachea. You've got the larynx down here, and then you are taking the trachea down into the respiratory system. Okay, olfactory receptors are where you smell. They are on the superior surface of the nasal cavity. The rest of the cavity is lined with mucus cells. We talked about that. Mucosa, which release the mucus so that it can be moisten the air. And its job is also to trap foreign particles. So it gets caught in the mucus, the cilia moves, and it moves the mucus out. The lateral walls have projections called conchae, and conchae adds surface area. It also helps to increase air turbulence within the cavity. So the air has more contact with the cavity, which allows it to warm it better, also to separate out particles. So I talked a minute ago about the fact that your nasal cavity is separated from the oral cavity by two plates. You have the hard plate, which attaches to your teeth, and then you have the back portion, or the posterior, the soft plate, which is made out of muscle. That ends in the uvula, which you see hanging down in the end. We have sinuses, and these are cavities within the bone. That's along the frontal bone, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and the maxillary. Function of the sinus is you do need to know they lighten your skull. They act as a resonance chamber for your speech, and they produce mucus that drains into that nasal cavity. You will not need to know the names of all of the sinuses, but you will need to know their functions. Okay, so the pharynx, or your throat, the passage is from the nasal cavity to the larynx. You have your nasal pharynx, which I talked about on the diagram, which is the superior behind the nasal cavity. You have the oropharynx, which is in the middle behind the mouth, and then the laryngogenopharynx, which is by the larynx. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are both areas where there is both air and food passing. It is after the laryngopharynx that you have the epiglottis that covers the trachea when you swallow. Okay, so structures of the pharynx. Your auditory tubes enter into your nasal pharynx, and that's part of what allows you to hear. Your tonsils are in the pharynx. I do not expect you to know about the tonsils and the adenoids, but that's what usually get removed when you have a number of infections. Your larynx is also what we call your voice box. It will route air and food into the proper channels, and it also plays a role in speech. The air that you inhale goes through the larynx or the voice box through the vocal cords and allows them to vibrate. That allows you to produce sound. So your larynx, or your voice box, is made of 8 rigid hyaline cartilages, and there is a kind of in a spoon-shaped flap of elastic. So the spoon-shaped flap of elastic cartilage is what we call the epiglottis. So it is at the top of the larynx. It is the largest of your hyaline cartilage. It protrudes anteriorly more for males than it does for females. At the top of it, you have your epiglottis, and your epiglottis is what blocks the trachea when you're swallowing food. It routes food to the larynx and air towards the trachea. So food to the larynx that will go back into the esophagus. It routes the air into the trachea to go down to the lungs. So inside of the larynx, you have your vocal cords. They vibrate with expelled air to create sound. So it's not on the inhale, it is on the exhale. If you've ever been in choir or sang, you know that how long you can hold a note has to do with how slowly you can exhale and maintain that breath. So the better you get at, more efficient you become at your respiratory system, the better you are able to use those vocal cords as far as singing, speech, etc. The glottis is the opening between the cords. Let me go back here. Sometimes it flips before I realize it's going to. So the glottis is the opening between the vocal cords that allows for the room for it to actually vibrate. The trachea is your windpipe. It connects the larynx with your bronchi, and the bronchi are the 2 major branches off of the trachea. It is lined with ciliated mucosa. It beats continually in opposite direction of the incoming air. So if I'm inhaling air into my lungs, the cilia is pumping the mucus back up and away from the lungs. So any dirt that it picks up, etc., can be pushed upward and away from the lungs itself. It expels the mucus loaded with dust and other debris from the lungs. You either cough it up or you will swallow it, which is why sometimes your stomach doesn't feel that great when you've got a lot of drainage. The walls of that are reinforced with C hyaline cartilage. Very different from the esophagus, because the esophagus is smooth muscle, and that esophagus tissue is closed a lot of the time unless you're swallowing, and it stretches and then has that contraction behind the food to move it, whereas the trachea is kept open at all times. If the trachea was not open at all times, you would not have that change in pressure in your lungs versus the outside, which is part of what allows you to inhale and exhale. Okay, the trachea is divided into 2 bronchi. they enter the lung at what is called the hilus or medial depression. It is towards the upper middle part of your lungs. The right bronchus is wider and shorter and straighter than the left. If you think about that, it does not have the heart, whereas if you look at the left side of your body, the heart is positioned there, which is part of why it is different in size. The bronchi are subdivided into smaller branches. Those branches are going to be called your bronchioles. So your lungs, they occupy most of your thoracic cavity. Kind of like the heart had an apex at the bottom. Your lungs have an apex at the top, and that is near your clavicle. And remember, your clavicle is that bone that lies along the top of your shoulder. We also call that your just blanked on me, collarbone. Base of your lungs rests on your diaphragm, which is your inferior portion. Realize the diaphragm is a flat muscle. It separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. It keeps an enclosed cavity in the thoracic cavity that has its own pressure as far as air, and it keeps it from losing that pressure. So each lung is divided into lobes or by fissures, kind of like the brain was. If you ever hear of somebody that has like lung cancer and has part of the lung removed, they usually have lobes of the lung that are removed rather than the whole thing. Your left lung has 2 lobes, your right lung has 3 lobes. Okay, so here is looking kind of at a cross-section of your lungs. If you look at the diagram here, this is the back with the backbone here. This is your front. This main tube, and it's showing the blood vessels. These right here are going to be the bronchi, the bronchioles that are coming off of that main blood vessel, or excuse me, off of your trachea. Notice all of the blood vessels in here and here parallel the bronchial tubes because they lead to the air sacs, and it has to surround and those air sacs so that it can, the arteries can bring the blood that is oxygen deprived to the lungs, and the veins can take those back to the actual heart. So notice your heart is right here, and your sternum is out here. The diaphragm is down below. So your coverings of your lungs, like all of your other organs, you have 2 different types of pleura. You have visceral pulmonary pleura, and that covers the surface of the lung, and then you have the parietal pleura, which lines the thoracic cavity. So visceral always lines the actual organ. Parietal actually lines the body cavity itself. Pleural fluids fill the area between the layers. It allows for gliding when you're inhaling and exhaling. It allows for smoother area so that the lungs don't actually get caught on it. So if you're looking at the bronchioles, you've got primary, whoops, sorry about that. I keep hitting it too soon. You have primary bronchiole, you have secondary bronchiole, tertiary bronchioli, and terminal bronchioli. So primary bronchi are the first branching off of the trachea. Secondary bronchi are branching again. Tertiary are branching again. When you get to the terminal bronchioli, that is where it connects to your actual air sac. So if you're looking at the smallest, so here we go looking at your lungs. So here is looking at a small section. So here you've got your the first branch, the primary bronchi. You've got secondary. You've got tertiary. The terminal bronchi is the smallest of the bronchi right before you lead into the respiratory bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles are the ones that actually connect with your alveoli, your air sacs. Once you get past the respiratory bronchioles, you actually have an alveolar duct that carries the air into the air sacs. Those air sacs give your lung a lot more surface area because the air is going to enter each of the individual sacs. If you did not have that, your lung basically would have less surface area because there would not be grooves. So you would have less absorption of air if it did not have all of these sacs that it was emptying into. So the air sacs give it the ability, number one, to have more surface area. Number two, each of those air sacs are completely surrounded by blood vessels, and those blood vessels will bring the deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to give up the carbon dioxide, and in the capillaries that surround the alveoli, the oxygen diffuses in to the blood vessels, and then it's taken back to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary vein so that it can be pumped through the left side of the heart and into the actual body. All of the smallest branches have reinforcing cartilage. No matter how small they are, they have cartilage in them to hold them open. The terminal bronchioles ends in alveoli. And respiratory zone, the part that you're actually breathing in, is starting with the respiratory bronchi, going into, remember, respiratory bronchi comes off of that terminal bronchi. Respiratory bronchi leads into the opening to the air tubes, which is called the alveolar duct, into the alveoli, which is where there is the site of gas exchange. Okay, your alveoli. The alveoli has an alveolar duct. It empties into a sac. You have your alveolus, and the gas exchange takes place within the alveoli in the respiratory membrane. So it is a moist membrane that allows the diffusion of gases back and forth. I will continue with this on Friday for another video on the notes. Go through and start working through your worksheets.